Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sibme Coach Replay show. I'm your host, Cory Camp, and I am so excited today, y'all. It's my blast from the past. One of my favorite former colleagues and friends, Andi McNair, is joining us. Andi, you are a force to be reckoned with when it comes to thinking about transforming education and learning from the youngest to the oldest learner and passion in education. And I'm just so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome, Andi.
I'm so excited to be here. I like that. A force to be reckoned with.
That's right. I knew you'd like that. I've been thinking about it all morning. I'm like, how do you introduce an old friend? But it really is true. Anytime I'm thinking about how can I redesign something so it'll be like something they've never seen before, I think of Andi, because that's used to be what you'd say every time. Anytime we had a session or a conference we were planning together, you'd be like, I just want it to be like something they've never seen before. And I'm like, well, we've never done this. So there we go. So much fun getting to work with you at the Regional Service Center down in Texas, which is where I was before Sibme. And you're still there. You're still doing a ton of work around digital innovation. Mm-hmm. But you also have your whole side gig. You've written a couple books. You're a published author and do a lot in the area of Genius Hour, which is where you and I really kind of first connected, thinking about, both ends of our spectrum of our exceptional learners and the type of instructional change that was really needed in order for everyone to thrive. And so, speaking of thriving, we're going to be talking about teachers today. And right now, all educators, not just teachers, we are all just surviving right now. I know everyone has that countdown to Christmas, and really it's just the countdown to the last day of winter before winter break. We are ready for it. We're exhausted. We need the break. We need some time to just breathe for a moment. But I know at the top of everyone's mind is also, how can I come back stronger and better and really finish out this year, on the best note possible. If you guys can hear my 6-year-old, she's playing with the dog, but that's fine. So Andi, let's talk a little bit about coaching teachers during this pandemic school year. What has that been like in your work? What have you noticed about being able to support teachers and helping them make the changes that they can as they work towards meeting all the needs of all their students?
Well, it's definitely a different time. I mean, I think every time I hear the words business as usual, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's just not the case. Like, I don't know that we'll ever go back to business as usual. And so I think some of these conversations that we're having and some of these things that we are having to address are things that most of us have never had to address before. Just the social emotional aspect of what we're experiencing right now with both educators and our learners is really at the forefront of everything that we do, but then also giving the content that is needed to kind of maneuver our current circumstances. And in our current circumstances, I think what is so kind of weird about this is that we don't really have a whole lot to draw from as far as these circumstances go, right? There were no best practices in place for emergency remote learning during a global pandemic. So it's not like there were any blogs you could go read or any YouTube videos you could go watch of what this looks like, because it happened almost overnight. And it just isn't a situation that we have found ourselves in before. And so thinking through that and really considering how to kind of maneuver this space that we're in, I think has required us to, number one, talk to a ton of teachers because they know better than anyone what they need and how they need it. And then it's taking that feedback and doing something with it, right? Once they say, this is what we need and this is how we need it, then it's so important that those of us that work in professional learning or help people with what this could look like, that we actually listen to that and react to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really has been doing a lot more listening. One, because that's part of what our teachers need right now is, they need to be heard. And so we can really understand what it is that they need that's most important right now and help them prioritize those needs as well. Because I know many teachers, I was a bit of a perfectionist in my classroom. And if it didn't go well, I was, ready to throw the whole thing out and start fresh. And we don't have the time or the energy to be doing that over and over again. So when we start to think about, and I'm glad that you mentioned business as usual. I've talked with a lot of really transformative educators and leaders who, they're looking at this very much like I am. We've kind of crossed this chasm in the use of meaningful use of technology and more student agency and ownership and teachers really being able to kind of think outside the box because they've had to, and that this will transform when we get back to in-person instruction and we're kind of moving throughout our day a little bit more business as usual. Instruction is changed for the better. We don't go back to our older practices. So, and that leads me to one of the reasons I asked you to come on the show is, you've had some good tweets out here lately. They're always good, but there have been a few lately that have just kind of spoken to me as a coach and where I am, and some of your blog posts as well, which I wanted you to come in and feature. And one of them is about leading that sustainable change. So talk to me a little bit about what are some tips you have for that.
Well, I think first of all, acknowledging that this has been a huge obstacle and there are obstacles that we are crossing every single day. But I think seeing this as an obstacle course and realizing that, obstacle courses seem hard when you're in the middle of it, but when you get to the end of that obstacle course, it's worth it, right? So I think that thinking about sustainable change is that idea of seeing opportunity in this obstacle that we're experiencing, right? To be able to look at this situation and say, you know what, this is hard and it's frustrating and there is so much that we have to learn, but we are willing to learn it, right? And we're willing to understand that we're going to be better for it when this is over. So I think that mindset has really helped me as an educator, as somebody who works with educators, to just every time. So for a while, it was like every time we would ask a question, there would be another question that would follow it and another question that would follow it. It was so hard to come up with answers. And now that we can kind of reflect and get into this proactive state versus that reactive state we were in, we're able to kind of find some solutions. And so I think that, as I think about sustainable change and I think about sustainability and what that looks like, I think in the world of education, there has to be two things that kind of come together for that to be a reality. And those two things are, is it manageable, right? Is it something that educators can do? And then is it meaningful for the learner? So it's kind of both sides, right? It's the whole thinking about it from the perspective of the educator and also thinking about it from the perspective of the learners that educator is going to be impacting.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about how can we use these two questions as coaches and leaders to support that? Because you're exactly right. Like we are rethinking and reflecting, but right now it's not that teachers aren't willing. It's just they're so exhausted. They are so beat down. They're hanging by a thread. And again, the winter break just can't be here soon enough. A new year, we're just never going to talk about 2020 ever again. Can't be here fast enough. But talk me through some of these, especially this manageable piece. That's been the thing for me as a coach that I've really had to look at very carefully as I'm working with my teachers.
Yeah. So in this graphic, I call this a realistic and considerate approach. And I think that that's the key word, right? We want to be intentional. We want things to have impact. But ultimately, we have to be really considerate of our educators right now. And that's what this piece does, asking ourselves, is it manageable? And not only asking ourselves that, asking them that. And so I actually have some questions that you can go through with teachers, because I think sometimes when we hear the word manageable, we think of the word easy, and that's not necessarily the case. There's not going to be a whole lot right now that's easy, spoiler alert. But I think that it's more, is it doable, right? Is this something that you can do right now? And then I think the other side of that is it's also not, you sitting down with a teacher and asking them to implement something or sharing something that is happening moving forward. And it doesn't have to be an option for them to go, well, it's not manageable, so not going to happen. Instead, I think that conversation needs to look like, this doesn't seem manageable. It does seem like it's going to be a little more difficult than it should be. So what can we do? How can we collaborate? How can we work together to make it so, right? How can we make it more manageable, and getting their input on that, giving them some ownership in that. Like I said, they're the ones doing the work. So when we say, is it manageable? That's not up to us. We don't get to decide that. That's up to the person who is putting it into practice.
Yeah, and I think that's an important kind of part of our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of one of my favorite questions. It comes from the book, The Coaching Habit. And I was just talking with my virtual coaching cohort about these 7 questions. And so they're fresh on my mind. But one of the 7 questions comes later on down through this kind of questioning protocol. But it is, if we're saying yes to this, what are we saying no to? Mm-hmm. Right? What are we kind of leaving that alone? If we say yes to trying out this new tool, we're going to say no to feeling super comfortable tomorrow in that lesson. And, it might be that we kind of fumble through the technology and have to learn a little bit, learning curve with our students. Or it might be that if I'm saying yes to this, then I'm kind of letting go of doing some other things. Or maybe one of the really smart things some of my teachers started doing this last month is, instead of trying to get all their lesson plans done for the whole week, they are just planning 2 to 3 days at a time. They're planning Monday through Wednesday so that they can think about their students formatively. And then Tuesday and Wednesday, they're creating the plan for Thursday, Friday. And of course, their district has given them that permission, but that is much more, especially as we're redesigning every lesson every day, and it's completely different in this more remote or socially distanced world. That is much more manageable than trying to get everything in. And then, the hard part about flipped and remote learning is you put it out there and then it's hard to make changes on the fly because parents have printed out the lesson plan or they've got everything already. And so I think just some of those simple changes are important, but I think we also have to think about, to make this manageable, do we maybe need to let go of something or let something just sit there for a little bit and put more attention over here?
Yeah. And I think too, one of the questions that I have on the graphic to kind of ask yourself or to ask educators, whether you are the educator putting in place, you're asking yourself this, or someone is asking it of you, to think, is there going to be a willingness to invest on my part? I've had that conversation so often lately, that's the definition of engagement. And it's just as important that we as educators are engaged as our learners. So is it manageable enough that I'm going to be willing to invest in this? And if it's not, again, then the question becomes, how can we make it so? So I like this idea of being really intentional about just saying out loud, is this something that is doable? Not easy, but doable. Is it something that's going to require a great deal of stress or frustration? Because that is not what we need right now. And is it going to result in that willingness to invest for educators that's necessary for something to really end up being meaningful for their learners?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that investment, if the answer is no there, if the answer is it's not manageable, and in order to make it manageable, we'd have to do a lot of different things, hinging on that, is it meaningful? And is it meaningful enough to go ahead and do a bit of work through a little bit of a learning curve? And that's where we come in as leaders and coaches, is to provide that support as they are settling into some new routines or procedures or strategies with their students, so that they can make that curve a little less of a peak to kind of climb up. So,
yeah. And I think, one of the things that I think it's important to say is that we as coaches or leaders or whatever the role is, we don't want to put anything in place that isn't sustainable, right? Then it becomes a waste of our time. It becomes a waste of everyone's time who we've asked to be involved. So we want to be thoughtful about this, not just for the educator's sake, not just for the learner's sake, but for the work that we're doing as well. Like, we want to make sure that it's going to carry over and that it's going to be sustainable moving forward. I think putting a Band-Aid on this situation is one of the worst things we can do. Instead, I think we have to think through, is this something we can continue to do moving forward so that it's sustainable, which then leads into that whole meaningful piece. So that second question, is it meaningful? When I wrote these questions, I was really thinking about that from the perspective of the learner, but there's so many different perspectives you can have on that question. but I think, I've always said, if what you're doing in your classroom isn't meaningful, it's a waste of your time and theirs. And I still believe that to be true, even if it's remote. And so we want to ask ourselves, is what we're putting out there, what we're asking to be done, is it meaningful? And so is it going to result in a willingness to invest from our learners? So it's both sides of that. Is it going to result in a willingness to invest from our educators and from our learners? And I think when that happens, that's kind of where the magic is, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And so much of what I've been focusing on in my work with the teachers I'm working with is trying to make sure that as we are learning maybe some new tools or new ways to use old tools, especially in the digital aspect of things, that they understand that this is going to be a worthwhile investment because it will work also in a face-to-face classroom, not just a remote classroom, or being very clear. And, this is a tool that's really at this time just great for this online space. And you may not use it in the in-person, but trying to make sure that we invest our time and focus our energy in some of those tools that are going to have an impact right now, and then also in the future when we return to classrooms. So So then let's talk a little bit more. If we've gone through these two questions of, is it manageable? Is it meaningful? Then how do we move beyond this surviving and into thriving, especially as we move into next semester, come back with a renewed energy? What are some of your tips for moving from surviving to thriving?
Well, first of all, I'm a big Survivor show fan. I wasn't until the pandemic, and turns out now I've watched every season, every episode. And I am, I really kind of had this aha moment one night. I was watching it, and there was this episode where there were a couple of people who were thinking about dropping out and quitting the show. And I was thinking, gosh, what would make you go through all of that hard stuff, like the elements and the relationships you have to form, all of that stuff, and then all of a sudden just be like, you know what? I think I'm out. I was trying to get into their head, like what would make me want to do that? And I really started thinking about the mindsets of the different people who come on to Survivor to play that game, right? There are people who come on to just survive. Like, I'm just trying to get to the end to win the prize or whatever. And those people, I think, don't really have the mindset that it takes to kind of weather those elements and withstand. It's the people who go on to thrive. In other words, they're not going on just to put one foot in front of the other. They are in the experience in order to grow and develop. Now, I want to say, first of all, I know how hard of a mindset shift that is, especially when you're in the middle of, like I said earlier, the obstacle course. It's so hard to see past the hard into the pieces that are going to really be worth it. But I think if we can, as educators, really start to be intentional, I say that word all the time, I feel like it's on repeat. But if we can be intentional about, I'm not just trying to put one foot in front of the other. I mean, I have to do that. But ultimately, if I can focus on growing and developing during this time, when it's over, I'll have something to show for it, right? There will be a reason that I've had to go through some of this difficult stuff. And so that's just really been a big message of mine, is first of all, helping educators know that no, you're not doing it wrong. I mean, like we said, there are no best practices, but can we collaborate, work together, hear from each other, share ideas so that we can move into this place of thriving? And I think the first piece of that is knowing why you're doing something, right? And big picture, like, why do you teach? Why do you do this every day? Why do you log in? Why are you teaching two groups of kids? What is your reason? I'm a big fan of coming up with your core beliefs, knowing what every kid deserves. And so I think that plays a big role in knowing your why. But I think also just day-to-day things, right? Knowing why you're using this tool, or knowing why you're asking your kids to do this. And then understanding that if there is an easier way to do that, or a more manageable way to do that, to be open to that and to be willing to kind of invest in the growing and developing that it'll take to make that a reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes great, especially, at this time, especially when we are just emotionally and physically spent as educators. sometimes the only light that we have right now is our passion and our why. Absolutely. Making sure we're staying connected to that as leaders, that we can help teachers with that by making sure that we are seeing where they're sparking joy with their learners and connection, and really helping them celebrate the good things that are happening in building relationships and creating a culture even online of learners. But then I also think, it's being intentional in our planning, right? So really starting to pick one thing and thinking about, like you said, what's the purpose of me using this tool, this Padlet? Am I using it to its full potential? Is it meeting its purpose? Do I need to consider something that's more manageable or more meaningful or a better fit for this? If not, then I'm going to keep using that as I am and move on to the next thing. So really helping, and this also comes to, for us as coaches, if we aren't doing a really good job of listening and understanding the why or in what it is they're trying to do, then it's hard for us to give them some meaningful support.
Yeah, you just actually took the words right out of my mouth. I was about to say that exact thing, is that as coaches, that's important not to get stuck on what you're comfortable with, right? You may be let's not lie, I'm a huge fan of Flipgrid. That's not a secret. But, in that moment.
That's a fever, y'all.
In that moment, that might not be what is most manageable or what is most meaningful for that situation. I can't imagine that being the case, but if it was, I think that it would be important to have that conversation. And like you said, to listen and be willing to pivot, just like we're asking teachers to do. It's so important.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's important. One of the things, and the reason I initially called you, is you had this tweet, and now I got to see if I can find it, but it was all about, kind of just rethinking how we are currently thinking about, I think it was goals specifically, and really just focusing on the growth piece of things. And so I want to lead us into that conversation, because I know that's one of the next pieces in your surviving to thriving, is prioritizing that growth. Goals are good. We should always have goals. But right now, it's me sitting down and even thinking about writing down a goal, and because usually I put down a goal whenever it's a bigger thing. Sometimes it just needs to be this one small thing, or maybe I don't have a goal and I'm just surviving. And so how can I move towards that mindset? So tell us a little bit about your perspective here.
Yeah, I just remember when I was in the classroom, and I just think that we as educators, kind of our personality, a lot of us, I know we're all different, but a lot of us focus a lot on meeting goals, right? And like you said earlier, we don't tend to like failure. We like to do things well, just who we are as people. And I think that right now it's really hard to get wrapped up in a goal, because then we feel like we're failing when we're really not, right? There's enough failure going on or struggle without us kind of creating this struggle that isn't really there. So I think instead of focusing on these big goals of, I want to have this many kids who show up to class, or I want to have, let's say your goal is to have 95% participation or 95% engagement, right? Willingness to invest. If that's the case, that can't be the goal. But what it can be is, I would like to have 2 more learners on than I had yesterday. Because it's those little pieces of growth, I think, that are going to keep us going right now. I think when we focus on big goals or things that we would like to accomplish, we don't know if those are going to be a reality right now, but we do know that we can improve, right? We can grow and develop. That's what thriving is. And focusing on that, I think, is what will keep a lot of us kind of keep our heads above water until we can figure some more of this out.
Yeah. And I found the tweet. I put it up here on the screen for folks. And really, this is just, it is so that spoke to my heart as a coach and as a person right now who, as a mom of 3 online learners and full-time worker and wife, a lot of days lately I've been surviving. So as you heard, my little one behind me, she was supposed to be in here for some quiet, reflective time out, and she just left. So she's cool, she's in there working on Prodigy, I'm sure. But yeah, really just focusing on those small wins. And again, as as coaches and leaders right now, sometimes, especially if I have a teacher who is just surviving, I've been using this terminology a lot. Visually, I see them heads down, kind of boots on the ground, and they're just marching on through as best they can, as strong as they can. And so sometimes we have to help them lift their head up and say, look over there, do you see that? That is a win. Let's celebrate that. Right. So, I think sometimes our teachers, we are harder on ourselves than others are. And right now I see a big priority for our leaders, our coaches. And a leader doesn't have to be a coach or an administrator or someone with a fancy title. It can just be the colleague next to you. You are a leader, those of you watching. And so look for those small wins and just make sure other people see their own wins, because it's hard right now. It really is.
It is. And I love that idea. And I love that just really mental image of seeing somebody, help a teacher lift their head and say, look, that is a small win. Because when you are boots on the ground and when you're in that moment and it's hard, sometimes you just can't see it. Right. Yeah. Gosh, I've gotten the question several times recently, how can the community help? How can the community provide support? And I think that's the response. Celebrate the small wins. Tell them what they're doing well. Now is not the time for a ton of advice or like, here's what I wish you would do. Instead, it's got to be, and if that is the case, it's got to be more of a conversation. It's just, I love that idea of helping them figure out those small wins and see them, because if you're just boots on the ground, head down, you cannot see that. They need help seeing that right now. So
yeah, definitely. All right. So then we'll kind of wrap up with your third piece in this surviving to thriving. And by the way, y'all, you can access the notes and takeaways from this episode by going to learn.sibme.com. We've got them up. We've got the links to both of these main blogs that we're kind of talking about from Andi's. So you can go and kind of read her insightful word in that as well. And find, it really is like a black hole, your website, because there's so much good stuff in there. So yeah, make some time this weekend to get stuck in andymcnair.com.
So clean up a little bit, maybe. Yeah.
Right. Go reorganize a little.
Do some housekeeping.
So then what's the third piece? So we've talked about making sure that we know the why, whether that is our deep and like big picture why, or just why we're using a specific tool or we need to use a specific strategy, focusing on the small wins. And then what's the next piece, Andi?
Yeah, I feel like it's a quiz now. What's the next piece, Andi? It's just perspective, right? Knowing that perspective matters and that it's a big deal. And sometimes as educators, I just know this from my experience in the classroom, my perspective impacted so many more people than just myself, right? My perspective impacted my learners. It impacted my conversations with parents, my collaboration with other educators. So I think just everything that we've talked about today, the whole meaningful and manageable, the growth over goals, all of those things require a shift in how you see what is happening right now, and kind of how we opened up with talking about this as an obstacle course. I would imagine, I always say I don't run obstacle courses often. It's not on my list of things to do. I've never run an obstacle course. I know, I don't. It's just not there. But that being said, I would imagine that there's a place within an obstacle course that you have to really say to yourself, look, this is hard. This is not fun right now, but it's going to be worth it, right? I'm not going to quit. I've got to do whatever I've got to do to get over this obstacle, to get to the next obstacle. And that whole mindset of whatever it takes to do that is what we as educators have to have right now. And we have to be willing to collaborate and reach out to each other and say, hey, I'm struggling. There is nothing wrong. I think we do not say that out loud enough. There is nothing wrong with struggling as an educator right now. There is nothing wrong with being completely exhausted and feeling like you aren't sure what you're doing and what's happening and feeling lost. There is no shame in that. We should be able to come together as a community and kind of create solutions and figure out what that looks like. And that requires a little bit of a shift in perspective from where a lot of us have been as educators, for sure.
Yeah. Now's not the time to kind of fake it till you make it kind of thing. That's going to be take you way longer than just saying, I need help, because I feel like, especially with my remote instruction classrooms, they are even more disconnected from their peers than they were when they were in the classroom next door and just saw each other in the hallway. There's no passing through. There's not as much opportunity to hear about these small wins that each person is having. So one thing we've been saying here a lot at Sibme is it's important to not only help the person celebrate their own wins, but also have a platform to share those wins out. In Sibme, that's our collaborative huddles, that's the library space. But making sure that others are aware that there are successful things happening, building that collective efficacy. But then, what I love about this piece, especially what you wrote in your blog, is the reflective capacity that you put in here. Making sure that we are staying in touch with our perspective and thinking about what was difficult today. What did I enjoy the most about today? How has my perspective changed? And I might even add, how does it need to change? Is a good question. And those are good questions for coaches to ask teachers as well when they do those quick check-ins. What are you finding difficult? What are you finding rewarding or working well? And how are you making that happen so I can share it with somebody else? All really important questions to be thinking and reflecting about. And I know a lot of teachers are going to be reflecting as they get some time over the winter break in a few weeks. So good things to think about within that.
Thank goodness for the break, right? We're all going to take a little bit of a breather. But yeah, I think that as we kind of wrap up, I think that's one thing I would really say is important is that being in that reflective state as often as possible, like daily looking back on that day and acknowledging, hey, I did some really cool things. They may be small, but I did some really cool things today. Maybe it may just be I didn't trip over myself and fall over. I mean, I have those days where I didn't do something terrible today. I didn't
talk for 5 minutes on mute. I mean, yeah, right. Little things.
A better example for sure. Yes. Yeah. But then also acknowledging that there were some hard things about today and knowing that everybody had hard things today. Everybody had things that they did well. Everybody had things that was hard. But then it's like you said, we have to be able to, within that circumstance, shift our perspective accordingly, right? That's what reflection is all about. Learning from it and then doing something with it. We love that quote from John Dewey, right? We don't learn from an experience. We learn from reflecting on an experience. So we don't learn from the daily grind of teaching. It's the reflection where that happens. So important.
Yeah, definitely. And again, this kind of bringing us full circle, that perspective, you can also add in, I mean, you could just ask those two questions. Is it manageable and is it meaningful? And what I did today manageable and meaningful? And how can I make a small adjustment tomorrow to keep it as so?
I love it.
I love it too. I always love our conversations, Andi. Y'all, we could keep talking for. Andi goes before we went live. She goes, "So are we talking for an hour or just 30 minutes?" And I was like, "I don't think people can handle us for an hour, but 30 minutes we'll kind of book for." So I know I'll probably have you back again in the new year, Andi. I'm super excited to now have you on my roster of coaches here on the Coach Replay show. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Make sure that you follow Andi McNair on Twitter. She's got some good tweets that have been coming out. Check out her blog. They're all listed in our notes and takeaways. Andi, anything else for our audience before we go today?
No, I think just to coaches and teachers and administrators, just thank you for the work that you're doing. And man, what exciting work we're going to get to continue to do as we do move toward that sustainable change in education. So I think that's
so true. So true. All right, everyone. Well, be sure to like and follow us here at Sibme as well, so you can get updates on all of our upcoming shows. In 2 weeks' time, we have Steve Barkley coming and talking more about that growth and challenging teacher growth in the second semester. So it's kind of our theme for this month, and I'm super excited to have Steve joining us. And Andi, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you all next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.